I'm Jeanne Allen, founder and CEO of the Center for Education Reform, and we are proud to bring you this fantastic event today with scholars and leaders in the fight and the quest to make our nation a more perfect union. We're proud to be an ASU GSV Summit sponsor again this year, and this just happens to be a unique feature of what otherwise is just our Why America initiative, aimed at ensuring that students and educators everywhere have access to incredible resources, ideas, and support in bringing about great understanding of civics and our country and our nation and its history, particularly in these very, very trying and difficult times. And so we have originally scheduled about 45 minutes. If you have time, I think we can go an hour. And I am so happy to turn over the mic, so to speak, not just to our moderator who's going to bring everybody in to speak to you, but all of our panelists. And so let me bring on Ian Rowe, who's currently a resident fellow at American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on upward mobility, education, family formation. He's a senior visiting fellow at 7076 Unites as well, a charter school leader, having started an amazing network already and setting up to do a new one in the Bronx in 2022. Welcome, Ian. How are you today?
I am great, Jeanne. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm so excited to talk, especially with a great population of teachers that are watching. So welcome to our discussion, a civics roadmap for online educators. As Jeanne said, this is part of the Why America 2020 series towards a more perfect union. As Jeanne said, my name is Ian Rowe, and for the last decade, I have run a network of public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I've seen how important it is for kids of all backgrounds to develop an accurate understanding of this country's history, the duality of opportunity and oppression. But it's also important that they understand and embrace the founding principles, the concepts of hard work, family, faith, free enterprise, entrepreneurship, to be a vehicle through which they can become agents of their own uplift, even in the face of their current circumstances or life's inevitable barriers. The goal of our discussion today is to help teachers, as I said, many of whom are watching right now, to develop a roadmap on how best to teach civics at a time in which many young people don't have a deep understanding of the country's founding principles, and there's much disagreement on what civics even means. At critical moments in our nation's history, our founding ideals and the founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and Constitution that embody those ideals have been challenged and required a defense. The country's founders themselves feared that the rise of political and cultural factions could tear the country apart if not checked. Madison even wrote about the danger of warring factions in Federalist 10. We are seemingly at such a moment again when protests and riots are happening in our streets, in which some people believe that America's founding ideals were false when they were written. Others believe that it's the very founding principles that should be embraced in order to heal historical injustices and reverse contemporary inequities. There are other debates raging as well, but the point is that no one, particularly young people, can have an informed debate if they don't understand the founding principles in the first place. Which is why I'm so honored to be joined by a panel of experts, Bob Woodson, Louise Dube, Jeff Rosen, and Rajiv Vinnakota, on how we can help teachers have the tools and the civics roadmap to continue our country on this march towards a more perfect union. So let me start with Bob Woodson. Bob, you have been a pioneer in the civil rights movement and a student of history yourself. Can you put this moment in context from a historical perspective in which There are competing ideologies, particularly around matters of race, but instead of honest debate around the founding principles, we now have a cancel culture that seeks to shut down dialogue. What should teachers know about this moment? Has it always been this way?
No, we at the Woodson Center for the last 38 years, we have assisted low-income grassroots leaders in 39 states, about 2,500 grassroots living in the most challenged neighborhoods, to understand that they have rights, but they also have personal responsibility. I think too often when we talk about addressing poverty, particularly low-income Black children, we always talk about them as if they have no capacity or no agency, no ability to achieve in the face of oppression. And therefore, whatever their destiny is determined by manipulation of external forces. Well, what we have done at the Woodson Center is we have demonstrated by our research that when whites were at their worst, Blacks were at their best. The assumption is that the present failures of kids in schools is related to the legacy of slavery and discrimination is patently untrue, because we've documented that between 1920 and 1940, the education gap was closed from within 3 years to 6 months. Because Blacks established 5,000 Rosen Booker T schools. And even though they were operating with half the budgets of white schools, it was their self-determination and collective will to achieve against the odds that caused them to close this gap. In the 1920s, there were 5 Black high schools that were, where the enrollment was twice the number of white schools with half the budgets. Yes, every one of those major Black high schools in urban centers like Atlanta, New York, New Orleans, and Washington, D.C., the students out-tested all of the white schools in those jurisdictions. So the point is, if Blacks are able to close the education gap, achieve in the face of oppression in those very troubled times, why can't we close the education gap today? We must stop just concentrating on institutional racism as the single culprit and begin to look for agency and ability to self-correct from within the community suffering the problem. We have evidence that that will to achieve still exists today.
And Bob, I'll want to come back to you to help teachers link that history back to the founding principles and the role that those played in those stories of achievement that you're talking about. Louise, I am very excited to have you on as well. You lead iCivics, which works to ensure every student in America receives a quality and engaging civic education and graduates from high school well prepared and enthusiastic for citizenship. You reach 125,000 teachers, 7.5 million students in 50 states. Can you talk about some of the tools iCivics currently offers teachers that they can immediately use in their classrooms regarding civic education?
So I thank you for the opportunity to be here. Obviously, Dr. Woodson has some pretty interesting and in some ways controversial ideas. I think they should be talked about in the classroom. We at iCivics have a very large and diverse set of students. And the election is a little bit like our Olympics, but we are in the classroom every day to teach about civics with free resources. So you can go to iCivics.org. We have 20 games and over 200 lesson plans and tools and so on that are available for teachers to use today, tomorrow. So I think the question is best taken by example. So I will give you some very practical tips about how to teach the election. because this is a controversial topic. We in our network of teachers have found that several teachers were told by their principals not to teach the election this year. That is a problem. And then other teachers have told us that—
With what rationale to not teach?
Because the parents find it too polarizing. The parents do not want their such controversial topics to be addressed in the classroom. There is clear research that controversial topics are productive in the classroom, actually. But you can understand a principal who's feeling under threat from the community on this topic. Or there are teachers who themselves are great teachers, but feel that this may not be the election because it is so polarized and so divisive. So with that, I will give you 4 ideas. So number 1, you can use the news as it is today, which the kids get, right? So let's just be clear. The kids live in our world. And so whatever's on CNN, Fox News, wherever, it's in their feed, and they will be asked, they will care about that. And they will come in having heard all about the protests, and they will want to talk about those things. So in many cases, the way to do this is to take a prompt from the news and to dig into history, right? Rather than deal with what is happening today that could be so polarizing in some cases as to be unproductive, you might want to say, oh, you want to talk about a debate? Let's go talk about Reagan and Carter and that famous line about, there you go again. So that would be one place to go to, and there are many, many other ideas as to how to do that. Just go dig for something that might be a way to get you from what their interest is to something that is important for them to know. The second is to say, we have an election today, it's about issues. Ultimately, it's about values and it's about issues. So let's go and research those issues. What do you think about things that you care about? So pick some issue, climate change. You can care about monuments. You can care about anything that's happening right now. Go and research both sides of these issues. You can use a site called Procon, has different ideas and topics. You can set up discourses within your classroom. So that's a very easy way to do that. At iCivics.org, we have the student election power sets of materials. Those have a way to allow students to research issues and then decide who they would vote for based on that, right? So don't go from the top down, but from the issues up. So that's the second one. The third one is, of course, our bread and butter, which is that we have all these games which simulate government processes. So for example, we have a game called Win the White House. That game, you can select your party, your candidate, you run a primary, you decide which state to go into, to put in an appearance, or to raise money. And really the goal of the game is to learn about the electoral college system, right? And we have seen many teachers set up leaderboards with competitions that really motivate kids. We also have a game called Cast Your Vote, which is about a local election. It's about the election process, how you should research issues before you decide on what candidate you want to support. The last one is local issues. So sometimes the local elections are a little bit less polarized. Sometimes they're not even partisan in any way. Go and talk to the candidates. Write letters about issues that are happening in your neighborhood. And so that might be a very direct way. Maybe we could engage a state legislator or a local council member, something like that. So those are all, I know I may be taking too much time, so I have so much more to say, but we'll leave it at that for now.
Oh, Louise, thank you. I mean, frankly, it's disheartening to hear that principals and teachers might be being dissuaded from speaking about the election. I mean, heaven forbid, where in the world would kids then be learning quality information about the candidates, about the policies? So and we'll have time to talk about that. Jeff, I'd love to bring you in. You lead the National Constitution Center, which serves as America's leading platform for constitutional education and debate. And your charter is to, quote, disseminate information about the United States Constitution on a nonpartisan basis in order to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people, unquote. I remember there was a great scene in the play Hamilton, in which Hamilton is imploring Aaron Burr to join him in writing the Federalist Papers so as to defend the Constitution. And it seems like we're in a similar moment with items like even the Electoral College, which was established in the Constitution, being challenged, or principals and teachers not wanting to even talk about the election. How can we equip educators with the tools to teach students about America's founding principles?
Well, the National Constitution Center has precisely that tool right now, and I'm so excited to share it with all of your teachers. It's called the Interactive Constitution, and I'm going to try to screen share it if I can manage the technology, and if not, I'll just describe it. This wonderful tool has gotten 30 million hits since it launched in 2015, and because it's coming up top when people are Googling the Constitution, the National Constitution Center is now the 4th most visited museum website in America. And it has exactly the tools that teachers need to teach founding principles and the basis of our American ideals in a completely nonpartisan way that's rooted in text, history, structure, and essays by the leading liberal and conservative scholars in America, discussing areas of agreement and disagreement for every clause of the Constitution. Recently, we launched a series of live online classes about the Constitution. We launched as soon as COVID hit. My colleague Curry Sautner and I teach 3 times a week. We've got 50,000 students who have signed up since we launched. I want all of you teachers who are watching to consider joining our teacher advisory board, getting professional support and enrolling your classes, either watch the live videos or the archive videos. And just this week, we taught the Electoral College and the voting provisions of the Constitution. And it's amazing how you can teach these provisions in a completely nonpartisan way if you just stick to constitutional law rather than to politics. So let's see if I can figure out the screen sharing. It's going to defeat me, so you're going to have to let me just describe it. So imagine I'm clicking on the election clauses of the Constitution in Article 1. And we're looking at the time, place, and manner clause. And there you have essays by Michael Moreland and Fernita Tolson, leading liberal and conservative scholars, about what the core of the election clause and the Electoral College was. And they talk about areas of agreement and disagreement, including contemporary arguments about whether or not to retain the Electoral College, which you can teach your classes as long as you do so in a neutral way, fairly giving the arguments, the constitutional arguments on both sides. Then there's an amazing provision called the drafting table that lets you see early drafts of every provision of the Constitution. So you can see James Wilson's original proposal that the president was popularly elected, and Madison's original proposal that the president was elected by Congress, and the compromise that ended up in the Electoral College. Teaching the Constitution by focusing on the text is a wonderful way to establish agreement and disagreement. Thank you so much, Jeanne. But you have to be my Zoom friend and click through to various provisions. But if you, I'm not going to try to guide you through it, but if you go back and find, I don't know, let's, if you, exactly. Well, there are 80 clauses of the Constitution, and I'm a law professor, and I learn something every time I go to this amazing feature. Then click on the media library, Jeanne, if you would. You see in the right-hand corner? Every week, my colleagues and I just do an amazing series of podcasts, videos, blogs. Here, scroll down a bit. Perfect. Look at this stuff. That's so cool. Here are the podcasts. The Constitution Drafting Project. We commissioned libertarian, conservative, and progressive teams to draft constitutions from scratch. They included Ilya Shapiro from Cato for the Libertarian team. Michael McConnell is leading the conservative team. Carolyn Fredrickson from the progressive side. and they discussed areas of agreement and disagreement. Go back, Jeanne. I'm going to be like a Ginsu knife salesman. I'm going to want to show you all this cool content. Then scroll back up. A conversation with Justice, just right there, with Justice Gorsuch. The honorary chair of the National Constitution Center is now Justice Gorsuch. His predecessor was Vice President Biden. Justice Gorsuch joined us on Constitution Day for an amazing hour-long conversation, which 15,000 kids signed up for live, about what it's like to be a justice and why the work of the National Constitution Center, iCivics, and all of the other organizations you're hearing from are so crucially important. Scroll down a bit more, then you have these videos, these public programs we do every week. I interviewed Lynn Cheney last week about her great new book, and this amazingly moving Liberty Medal to Justice Ginsburg, which was posted the night before she passed, and convened her favorite opera singers and special friends to pay tribute to this glorious hero of the American Constitution. Those videos are available there. Blog posts about historical issues in the news, and then finally, if you scroll down, these educational videos. So these are scholar exchanges or the live classes. We do them for middle school, high school, and the high school ones are appropriate for college as well. Friends, you're teachers, you know how challenging remote learning is. I can just say as a teacher, it is so meaningful and moving to be able to interact with the kids. I always encourage them to read the concurring opinions as well as the dissents. We had last week a middle school student, Oliver, who said, I'm only 9, I'm not sure I can read the dissents, but I said, I know you can do it, Oliver. And essentially, our evangelistic mission is to bring the tools and methodology of constitutional lawyers to all citizens starting in middle school. And that, we believe, is the way to unite all sides, to teach areas of agreement and disagreement, to focus on the text, to allow students to separate their political from their constitutional views, and ultimately to unite around the founding principles that unite us. It is such a meaningful mission. I was so eager to be able to talk to you all tonight because I really want you to consider signing up. You can email me, jrosen@constitutioncenter.org, or my colleague Curry Sautner, and help us spread the word. That's all we're asking for, to just allow this beacon of light, this wonderful learning tool, to be distributed as widely as possible so that all of us can converge around the ideals that unite we the people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. That seems like an incredible resource. Teachers, please definitely take advantage of what you've just heard from Jeff and Louise. I mean, in my former life, I actually used to run at MTV what's called pro-social programming, our Choose or Lose campaign. So every 4 years, our goals were to mobilize more than 20 million young people to vote. And oftentimes we had to figure out ways to translate resources like what you're seeing at the Constitution Center, which are amazing for adults, but sometimes for low-income kids or kids in other communities, they don't necessarily connect, and you've got to figure out ways to translate this content in ways that will really resonate with young people so they can really start to immerse themselves to see how these issues affect their lives on a day-to-day basis. And so Rajiv, I'm excited to bring you into the conversation now because your fellowship foundation organization has been doing a ton of research around how to engage young people on how best to understand our country's history. Can you talk a little bit about the organization, the research you've done, and techniques that you think you could offer to teachers that they could be able to adopt in their classrooms?
Sure, and thank you for having me here. It's always tough to follow Jeff Rosen. I've actually done this a number of times. When I saw the list, I was like, there I go again. I think it's last names that gets me in trouble. But I will say ditto to everything that's been said already by my esteemed panelists. Just this morning, I was moderating a panel at Johns Hopkins University on why tough conversations matter and how to support teachers in delivering and having the support from administrators to deliver, debate and engagement around issues in the classroom, because we know that that allows young people to be able to internalize, think about different sides of issues, be able to debate them, right? Everything, all those fundamental aspects that we take for granted in this country, which of course come from that Constitution and from the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. So the two things I just want to talk about, the work that I started about 1.5 years ago in looking at civic education in its broadest sense possible, I identified a couple of things that sometimes get lost. Number one is that schools are, of course, at the center of this work because it is something that everyone engages in. However, too often we forget all of the other resources that are available to us that should be leveraged. So even as history teachers are listening today, especially in this virtual environment, I would ask you to remember that there are parents, that there are supporters, that there are people at home who can utilize a lot of these resources. Jeff's, everything from the Constitution Center, and as a data set N of 1, I would tell you it's amazing. Parents can access this information as well. I know that iCivics has a whole family kit for being able to play with young people. And that parents provide a lot of the, not just backup, but can be complementary and supplementary in terms of making sure that these capacities, that this knowledge base is all developed in young people. And we often forget that, and we dump so many demands upon our teachers. And now here's an opportunity for teachers to say, hey, look, I want to be able to use additional resources, right? Bill of Rights Institute has a number of other resources as well that you can use effectively. And so leverage all of that. The second thing I would say is from projects that we have funded and supported over the last 4 to 5 months, where we have helped young people who want to engage civically in their communities to address issues related to COVID and so on. In supporting them, we have recognized something through our research, that those that are effective because they are scaffolded by adults. That is, adults are around them providing the support, the history, the context, their own experiences in terms of helping young people understand how to be able to engage effectively. And so young people sometimes have a tendency to want to just go run to the barricades, and actually they need to learn a lot more, and they're actually open to it. I was just talking with 7 of the young people who are engaged across our grantees, and the more they engage with the adults, the more that they realize they were learning so much in terms of how to be better citizens through that interaction, through that working together. And so don't lean back, lean in.
Got it. Thank you all. Just one follow-up question, because we have been talking, these are fantastic tools. One very real topic that I know many teachers are grappling with, they're in communities where there is debate about something called the 1619 Project that the New York Times launched about a year ago. A curriculum has now been distributed in what seems to be thousands of classrooms in the country. And yet you really want to engage in a more of a broad definition of not only the African-American experience in the United States, but the whole history of not only the legacy of slavery, but also the legacy of excellence and resiliency in the face of slavery. What do you say to teachers who are in those situations right now? They might be getting pressure or mandates to teach a certain curriculum, but are looking for compelling alternatives that they may feel that they want to broaden what they expose their kids to. Anyone want to take that on?
The last speaker talked about the importance of parents, and I really agree with that. But unfortunately, when it comes to low-income Black parents, there's almost now a blanket exemption from any responsibility for the parents to participate in the education of their children because of 1619 and the blanket assumption that there are disparities in educational outcomes for kids, that is always associated with racism, and therefore, or institutional racism, and therefore the emphasis has to be removing those barriers. If there are disparities in suspensions, the teachers are accused of being racist, and therefore, if kids are disruptive, you're supposed to excuse that and not suspend children or take actions. And so what you have now, as I said, with this blanket exemption in the name of racism, and what schools are doing is applying all kinds of extra remedies that address racism, Loudoun County school system recently school board issued a statement saying that teachers are not permitted to question or challenge any of these interventions that have at their core addressing race. And then even in their personal Twitters or Facebook, if they get caught questioning any of these decisions around racial, they will be fired. So how can you create an environment where there is exchange and debate when there's this rigid application of an exemption of Black children and parents from any personal responsibility? To me, that's worse than discrimination.
Wow. Wow. Well, and yet there's so much energy on the streets. We see protests, rioters. We see a lot of young people engaged in both peaceful protest as well as non-peaceful protest. To the group, do you think young people understand the history of protest in this country, how it again links back to the core principles in the Constitution? Jeff,
Well,
did you add?
Starting with the Constitution is always a good place to start. So just at noon today, we had a wonderful panel with Michael McConnell and Cristina Rodriguez about immigration and the Constitution. They're from different perspectives, progressive and conservative, but both agreed that the place to start in debating the president's power over immigration was with the debate over the Alien and Sedition Acts, and in particular, Madison and Jefferson's Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. We all know, and more Americans should know, that Madison and Jefferson objected to the Sedition Acts for violating principles of protest and free speech, because as they said, speech is a natural right that comes from God or nature, not from government, and therefore that it shouldn't be able to be infringed unless it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. But I didn't know before this great debate today that it was actually the Alien Friends Act that caused the most controversy. That allowed President Adams essentially to deport on his own any alien legally in the US he liked for whatever reason without any process. And that was both an affirmation of the Federalist vision of the president's incredibly broad power over immigration, despite the fact that Congress seems to have the lead, but also the fact that he didn't use it shows how uncomfortable people were with it, and it was allowed to lapse. So that was a bit of history I learned today. I teach this stuff, I live and breathe it. I learned something from history every single time we look closely at a historical episode that's relevant to today. I'll just give one other quick example, how to talk about the possibility of court packing from a nonpartisan perspective. For our podcast, I figured the best way to do it was to pick some 19th century history that I didn't know too much about, and we had a wonderful podcast about how the court jumped up and down a bit during and after the Civil War, and the details are relevant. And it turns out that it was a combination of administrative convenience, a desire to expand the circuits, and partisan advantage that blended in a complicated mix. So that's what's so exciting about studying history. You initially asked, do Americans know enough about it? Of course they don't, because we don't, because I don't, because I'm a teacher of history, and I can't know anything meaningful and deep until I have the humility to dig in and open my heart to folks who know more about it than I do and have a civil debate. So that's why teaching history is so important, and we can always learn from it.
So Jeff, you're right. I mean, it's almost bottomless, the learning that can happen, which is why understanding at least the core is so important. And so maybe all of you, what should that core be? I mean, you just raised an interesting question, which is again another issue in this current debate. There's a possibility that the Supreme Court of the United States might actually increase in size. Now, most people don't know it is 9 now. It hasn't always been 9. It was a lower number, but now it seems like it could be increased. How should teachers think about even that one singular issue? Is that a danger to our country? Is that just a congressional act that can be executed, that's just part of the American way of life? How should teachers, again, this is to all of you, think about even that issue to bring that into the classroom?
So we the way that we've brought in issues is always to pivot off of the issue, to go back through history and through time. For the protest issue, we have recently gone to the women's suffrage movement. A lot of times people have learned about the civil rights movement or learned about other protest periods in our history in some kind of sort of with a sheen, right? It becomes this person that's did this great thing, and there's no context, there's no an idea of their personal cost to what happened, and actually how the progress was not linear. It took a lot of turns, it took a lot of institutionalization, it took a lot of many different pieces to it. And so we go back to those times and talk about how change actually happens in our historical records. And the Supreme Court would be the same thing. I would go back and talk about how that happened over time. I think your broader point is a really important one, which is that teachers today are faced with a much harder job. What it is that a civic participant in this country needs today is a whole lot harder than what it was 150 years ago, whatever it was. It requires you to understand how media is communicated, for example. So one of the key things that we do at iCivics is to provide free resources so that you can understand how to discern real information and how to check your sources and how to actually think about what happens in the algorithms and on social media. You think that kids are digital natives. They do not understand how exactly the Facebook algorithm works, and neither do we. So you have to learn some of these critical tools. That's one. You have to learn a whole lot of more history, and you also have to learn a whole lot of more of nuance and gray. There are a lot of issues that are being presented as one thing or another thing. The actual, once you start digging into the history, there's a lot of nuance there. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of common ground. I think you need to just be better. We need more and deeper and more rigorous content, not less. That's why I'm so worried that teachers are feeling the pressure not to teach.
Bob, I saw you were trying to get in as well. Okay. So Rajiv, when you think of the role of media and young people, it has such a huge influence on how young people think about these issues. Even the idea of protest, some people see young people and they think, for example, protest and violence are synonymous, that this is a tool that should be part of how change happens in our country. Again, how should teachers, as Louise just talked about, think about the role of media, both to capitalize on it as well as limit its influence when young people think about these kinds of how to understand their founding principles?
That's a great question, Ian. I don't think that young people, and I'm going to use the 150 different groups that applied to do work with us this summer and into the start of the school year, and the ones I've been engaging with most closely. My sense is that they don't view protest as an end in itself. Really what they're trying to do is change policy. And so the part about this that, where adults can be so helpful is about getting them to understand how does, right, to Jeff's point, how does the Constitution work, but then bring it all the way down to what Louise said, which is the local issues, right? How can I make an impact on a very local level? Like, what does that actually require? How do I galvanize people to support me? And, we had a number of our projects that were able to have conversations with the mayor, for example, in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And over the course of conversations over 2 months and engaging with them, the mayor, by the end of it, said, I need to institute a youth council to be able to provide input for us, right? That's not protest. That's actually creating structures to be able to provide input into policymaking. Similar types of actions have happened across all of our grantees that we're supporting. So I don't think it's that young people are going, oh, I want to protest. Rather, what they're trying to do is say, I want to be able to have an input, both in terms of the agentic sense, but also I want to be able to advocate for certain points of view. And that's where the role of a teacher, the role of parents, the role of community partners really comes into play to say, okay, so now we understand that. What are the actual means to do that? And that's where history and civics and government knowledge become so critical.
Yeah.
Yeah, may I just comment on that? Just a footnote. I think it's important to teach about protests, but students are not taught what kind of protests, the nature of it, the history of it, how it's been done in a way that can most affect change, where you observe the values of those that you're protesting. And if they would study the history of the civil rights movement and how those protests were carried out and how it was done in a civil way, it was intended to promote discourse rather than to destroy an enemy. It was to, in the words of King and others, the way you destroy your enemy is make them your friend. And Dr. King and others demonstrated that the protest was a matter of actionable grace in action, where your purpose was to prick the conscience of your opponent and try to encourage change, but it was always peaceful. And I don't think that students, when they're talking about, are ever taught how protests were carried out effectively, particularly in the civil rights movement. It's almost been put on the back burner.
Wow, thank you for that, Bob. And one thing that's interesting that you and Rajiv point to, that a lot of young people in particular look at protests as a pathway to change, and specifically policy. Just for a moment, everyone talk about what is the role within civics of behavior and cultural norms? Is civics just focused on policy and government knowledge, or is it also this idea that America is focused on both rights and responsibilities? What component of that should we talk about as relates to teaching civics and the responsibilities of citizens in a self-governing free society? Rajiv?
So Ian, this is music to my ears, because in the end, I think there's a tendency to forget that, once again, civics is not an end in itself, and that actually school is not an end in itself. Though knowledge is important, the reason why we created public schools in this country was so that we can develop citizens, right? And that thinking about having a well-informed, productively engaged for the common good and hopeful citizenry should be at the core of the work that we're all trying to do. That's actually, frankly, been lost over the last few decades. And there's been lots of demands. And as someone who has, like you, started multiple charter schools and been in the education reform movement, I think that come to realize that the tilt of the balance towards reading and math and English, though as important, has had an unintended consequence related to it, which is we have forgotten the social studies. And we have forgotten civics, especially even within that social studies, and it has dropped to the bottom. We can quote all kinds of really depressing tales about how little investments are made into this space relative to other spaces. Let me just put that off to the side for a moment and answer your question, which is that the only way that we can think about citizen development is to have concepts of being well-informed, that productively engaged for the common good requires both skills, dispositions, and capacities, and a sense of hopefulness in the country in which you live and that you can actually make a change. And it is absolutely our responsibility to make sure that young people have all of those. Now, when I say our responsibility, I'm not looking out and saying, you, history teacher, have that responsibility. It is our responsibility who are involved in educating and developing all of our young people.
No, Rajiv, that's great. And by the way, just a quick story, in New York State, where I led schools in 2010, the New York State Regents decided as a cost-cutting measure to eliminate the annual state test in social studies in grades 5 and grades 8. And over the course of 10 years, the average school, elementary school, now only has social studies 2 times per week, 45 minutes per day, 2 times per week. It's unbelievable. Why would we expect young people to have a strong understanding of a civic education with that kind of time allocation? Louise, it sounded like you wanted to get in as well.
Just a very quick analogy. Civics is a lot more like sports. It's like being put on a field knowing nothing and not being in shape and not having necessarily the skills to deal with your teammates and the will to win. So it's a little less like math, a little more like sports. It's all around.
You know, I want to just jump in really quick, Ian. You've been doing a fantastic job, and I know I want you to answer some of these things too, but we had a few questions in the queue from some of our educators online, and I hope you don't mind. I'd like to bucket this.
Absolutely.
Kind of throw it and have you also answer it, Ian, and maybe I'll start with you and go there. And actually jumps off of what Louise was just saying. You know, when you think about sports, you think about anything, it's work, right? Relationships are work. Everything we're doing now is work. It's hard to do what we're doing even in Zoom now. And it takes practice and discipline. I don't know about you, but a lot of kids, our teachers are right now struggling, especially in a virtual environment, to get that away. We've got this great master teacher recognition program we're launching to recognize them for their extra hard work. I'll talk about that later. But here are the 3 really interesting questions that just came up, and I think they're connected. One comment is civility and morality are largely absent from civic discussions. I think it's that fear, right? And then another comment on that, Laura Burgess says, we need to talk about values where we've been, shared values. So comment on that civility and morality discussion. How do you have a conversation with students in the absence of that and not worry about offending them, by the way? And then the third one is it sufficient to teach only how of representative government, or should teachers present the values? So not just the values at stake in what we're doing, but the value of representative government. There's a lot of people running around going, this government stinks. And I think teachers are afraid to say, whoa, 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 whoa. Does it really?
It's a powerful question. I mean, in my own experience running schools, anytime we thought about teaching tough concepts that might be inaccessible to students, the first step was always, okay, let's try to pick perhaps another moment in time to let kids know that this isn't the first time that we're going through this as a community, as a country. So even today, like, you know, Bob has talked a lot about the debate raging within the Black community. You know, a century ago, there were debates between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington about the path forward for the Black community, about economic empowerment and agency, you know, versus civil rights, you know, very broadly categorized. But this idea of civility and morality was respectful debate. And I think it's very powerful to go back in time. And this is where civics and history could be inspiring, to show that our nation has had lots and lots of moments of tumult, and we've made it through. Why? Because we've been able to constructively disagree. And I think the more that we can bring those moments to life for kids, the more that we can help them adopt the same behaviors today.
Yeah, you were talking about values, and I was just looking at Samuel Adams. He said, a general dissolution of principles and manners will more surely overthrow the liberties of America than the whole force of a common enemy. That while the people are virtuous, they cannot be subdued, but when they lose their virtue, they will be ready to surrender their liberties to the first external or internal invader. And I think that's how important these are, that democracy and capitalism are but empty vessels into which we pour our values as a nation. And for values and principles and virtues not to be taught or discussed is one of the reasons that we're in this mess that we're in today.
And I want Jeff to on this too. And let me add to that another comment that came in from an educator parent out there. What I'm finding is so much of the conversation about issues of values have become activism. There's no argument or debate or even deep thinking. There's a declaration and then shaming of those who don't see it that way. Kids learn to just stay quiet and then they complain when they get home, she says.
A very important comment, and Bob Woodson spoke so eloquently about virtue and civility. So how to teach both of them. The thing to say about civility is this is not just a feel-good kumbaya call for mushy agreement. It is core to the democratic project. And the way to teach it is to model it. And that's why it is so urgently important when we teach to bring together people of genuinely diverse perspectives. And it's easy to do when you teach the Constitution because there are good arguments on almost every constitutional question. Just as Supreme Court opinions have majority opinions and dissents, we can always bring liberal and conservative scholars for respectful dialogue about agreement and disagreement. And friends, I can't tell you how moving it is in these polarized times. Every week, almost every day, to host these very substantive, very rigorous, and very respectful civil discussions among people who vigorously disagree. And it's because the ground rules are so clear. We will only discuss the Constitution and law. We will not discuss politics. And we insist that all sides are represented and everyone gets equal time. And by modeling that, it gives the panelists, it gives me, and it gives everyone who's watching hope that there is more that unites us than divides us. So I'm very much an evangelist for the importance of modeling this. As for virtue, it's true that one person's virtue is another's activism. And if you insist that your policy views are virtuous and anyone who disagrees with you is wicked, then we're not going to get very far at all. I think it's very helpful, and I've learned a lot from teaching about virtue from a historical perspective. So as Bob Woodson suggested, virtue was central to the founders' conception of the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson said, happiness is the aim of life, virtue is the foundation of happiness. When he talked about the pursuit of happiness with the other founders, he didn't mean feeling good, he meant being good. What did the founders mean by virtue? They meant self-mastery. It was the classical virtues. They were reading the Stoics and the Epicureans, temperance, prudence, humility. These were all mastering your unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear so that you could serve others in the common good. So you can, it's a very interesting history. You can teach it without getting into the divisive policy questions about which no people are going to agree. And I think in a surprising way, both sides are coming back to recognizing the importance of virtue. The word had gone, of course, out of fashion for a long time and it had been associated more with the right than for the left. But now that we are living in an age of where we've seen the consequences of a failure of self-control on our elected leaders on both sides of the aisle, teaching character and virtue as the founders hoped is indeed central to the survival of the republic.
Jeannie, Jeannie, if I could, I would just like to agree so much because at our 1776 Unites campaign, we're bringing together not only scholars, but community activists who model those virtues. Because the way you convince people of the veracity of those virtues is to see those virtues in action. We have 80% of my closest friends are ex something. They have letters in front of their names, not in back, because they were drug addicts, they were predators, but through God's grace, they became transformed and redeemed. And so if you want to know what is the virtue, let me introduce you to someone whose actions model those virtues. And so it means more people can begin to understand those virtues. So part of 1776 Unites is we have this combination so that scholars can cite the practical experiences of our men and women, and each can validate the other.
Wonderful.
Jeff, this is Raj. Didn't the virtue that the founders were talking about also include the more community civic virtue, the Aristotelian conception that you take the needs of the community above your own personal interests?
Crucial.
Yeah.
Jefferson, absolutely. Jefferson is getting
Absolutely.
straight from Aristotle, filtered through the Stoics and Epicureans, but it's all about overcoming selfishness and serving others. And in that sense, it connects to the notion of agape or universal love, which Martin Luther King invoked in the Birmingham jail.
I'll just add that we're talking about it on an individual basis about virtue. We also have to think about these values within the context of our institutions and in the need to merge and to think about values within when we teach about our institutions, whatever they are. The institution is a system, but the system embeds its values, which were in our Declaration of Independence, for example. And so we do need to wrap that circle.
You know, it seems to me, and Ian, I'm not stealing your job. I just really want you to cover this too and answer this one. But it also seems to me that what you're saying, which is to me, maybe I'm just a little wonky and nerdy. It's so exciting to hear you talk about this. And I think students would be so excited to not talk about all this kind of crazy nonsense going around, but to actually delve into what was talked about and what was the vision, right? So to that issue, let me ask this question and kind of go back and start with Ian again and go back through all of you. And this is from Mrs. Spencer, our patron for this amazing program. Some curricula teach U.S. history beginning with the Civil War, claiming there's so much to cover and the beginning of the country's history is covered in government class, which is true. I mean, I had that. I'm like a nation at risk baby. I got like snippets. What do you think of that decision to separate the founding from the rest of the nation's history, as if everything was a separate period of time?
Yeah, that sounds like unnecessarily separating. One thing I'd like to say, as I'm very excited, because my next project is designing a new character-based International Baccalaureate high school in the South Bronx, and the entire school will be grounded in the 4 cardinal virtues:
Wow.
courage, justice, wisdom, and temperance. So I'm excited to hear the affirmation of that decision. I mean, de Tocqueville in chapter 13 of de Tocqueville's America, he said, quote, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults," end quote. I have always loved that statement. I find it very compelling because it resonates with the notion that America is always in pursuit of becoming a more perfect union. And I think kids, once they see that parallel within themselves, will start to understand, like, wow, maybe within this country, maybe within these founding documents are the tools of self-betterment, are the tools of self-renewal that I can apply to my own life, regardless of my current circumstance. So I'm just really excited by this conversation. I don't like those artificial breakups that you just described, Jeanne. I think, I think one of our big challenges is getting back to what is the core that we've got to ensure our kids coming out of elementary school, middle school, and high school. What's that core knowledge? I know that Edie Hirsch talks about this a lot, but I don't think we've ever grappled with a nation with a clear understanding of what that really does need to be.
Yeah, just a quick note, and that is the challenge for many is how to live free. That is a challenge for some people. I think it was Shelby Steele that recently said that if you do not know how to live free, then you recreate your oppression.
Mm.
And I think that's what we're witnessing. It's like C.S. Lewis said that some people don't realize that some prisons, the locks are on the inside.
Mm.
And I think that I think that's a great way to maybe start moving. I think I would love to hear you, and I think everybody else would, for hours, to start moving towards closure and to remind people that this is just the beginning a semester-long program and exclamation, but that all of these individual scholars and leaders in front of you have everything at their fingertips, and other people, as you've seen, to be able to help you guide your students, whether you're sitting in a virtual environment or not, whether you're the parent educator right now or the teacher educator in a college or community, or doing the work of policymakers trying to encourage people. I think this has been so valuable because, you know, the biggest challenge we have right now is all of us together is kind of going back to that notion of having the conversation, talking about a protest or talking about how you feel without being shut down. And for some of us, our favorite times in school was when we could have a civil argument. And actually we're required or challenged by teachers to back it up with facts and some citation, rather than proverbial like so in response, right? And so it's encouraging teachers who are great to challenge their students by giving them the tools which you all have. Let me just ask you maybe to end with, and Ian, I want you to close, but I'm going to throw out one more thing and then have you end. What's the one conversation maybe that you might suggest, one civics related conversation to have with your children or students before the election? What would you say to take to them, each of you? And then Ian, I'm going to shut up and let you close.
If there's only one, it would be to understand the Electoral College.
Did you vote? Why? Why not? Who'd you vote for?
Right. Great.
I just want to offer grace to our teachers who are trying to do all of this in this really difficult moment. So thank you for what you're doing.
Mine would be respect the outcome.
I'd love a conversation of how is the idea of America encapsulated in the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights.
Yeah, I would also want to thank our teachers. And I think I'd want young people to understand that the election is not an end, it's a beginning. And more so this idea that human beings are imperfect. Even the founders that created this country, they laid out incredible, inspiring ideals, and we're all in a constant effort to fully live up to them. But how we've made steady progress as a country is through civil discourse, constructive disagreement, and a strong foundation in our civic life. And my hope is that today, all of our educators were able to get more tools to help young people understand that. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you for everything every teacher does with kids throughout our country. Thank you very much.
I second that. Applaud you all for joining us. Just please remember that, again, we're just trying to be a conduit and kind of a collector of great people, ideas, and resources. The teachers that are participating can register to get recognition, to register to get credit, to be part of earning the recognition that includes as prizes and being part of a forum in the future. And your students will be able to also compete and participate in a contest. And we have 10 more of these that we will promote and schedule. And I hope each one of you will join us again on another panel. And please reach out to me to do that. And again, I thank all of you for spending this time after your busy day teaching. Thank you all, and God bless you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you
So much.